All right. Welcome back. I hope you had a great lunch. We will move forward to the next two duo talks about the moonshots. So the first moonshot is responsible mobility, basically to protect us in all traffic situations in order to reduce all traffic-related accidents, but also to bring emissions to zero. Two speakers. First up is Matthijs Bootsman. He's a seasoned data scientist working at Lynxx, which is a Netherlands, Australian-based data science consultancy firm operating mainly in the transport and mobility domain. He has worked on several projects that attempt to predict and influence crowding in both public transport and the public domain. Secondly, we have Soora Rasouli. She has a background in transportation engineering. She specialized in developing models on citizens' travel behavior. She's the chair of the Urban Planning and Transportation Group in Eindhoven, University of Technology, and her brain is intensively engaged when working on topics which are on the research frontier. And thus she has no example to follow. And also she adds that by engaging her brain actively, she hopefully postpones the shrinkage of her brain while getting older. Can't argue with that. So the topic they will discuss is prevention of overcrowding by incentivizing people to take a stroll on attractive paths by AI.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to kick off this presentation today by actually telling you about a situation that I often find myself in, and that happens especially in summer, because I have quite a small apartment, and my bedroom has more windows than it has walls. So when it gets hot outside, and it's not often in the Netherlands, but when it does, it gets really, really hot in my bedroom. So my first response, waking up on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, is to actually get out of the house and go to the beach as soon as I can. The problem is, before I'm even close to the beach, I end up at this long, long line of cars filled with people who all have the same idea, who all want to go to the same direction, waiting on the same parking spot that's going to be occupied for the next 4 hours. And then I sit there wondering, how did this happen? Like, I have all this information at my fingertips, but still, here I am, standing in a hot car, waiting before I can go to the beach. And it frustrates me enormously, so that is what we're going to talk about today. To be more precise, we're going to talk about overcrowding, how to predict it, and how to prevent it. So my name is Matthijs, and behind me is Soora. And the general title of our presentation today is Responsible Mobility. And that is kind of the angle we're going to take here. So I'm going to kick off by telling you about crowd prediction models used in public transport and in the public domain. And then I'm going to show some results from a pilot that we did in and around the city of Amsterdam, where we tried to predict and prevent overcrowding. At the end of my talk, I'm probably going to say that there's still a lot of room for improvement in that pilot. Spoiler alert. And that's where Soora is going to take over to talk about how we can actually incentivize people to change their behavior and prevent overcrowding. So let me kick off by crowd prediction in public transport. And the second that gets mentioned, usually the attention is always focused on Dutch railways, specifically the train in the morning peak. Like here in the Netherlands, we have this idea that we all need to be at work between 8 and 9 in the morning. So we go to the station, we jump in the same train that everybody else is taking, and then we complain that our journey is uncomfortable. Like, there's not much we can do about this. And if we look at this from a crowd prediction perspective, even a very simple model can pick up undercrowdedness in the morning peak. But there's nothing we can do about it because the capacity of the rail has actually almost been maxed out, and the flexibility in the operation of Dutch railways is minimal. So the business case itself is kind of a dead end, and the only thing we can do is take very extreme measures, such as asking universities like these to start their lectures at 10 a.m. instead of 9 a.m., so we can prevent that huge crowd in the morning peak. Because the business case is a bit of a dead end, I actually wanted to talk about a more interesting case, to my opinion, which is that of bus operators. And their business case is quite straightforward, because if it's very crowded, they can scale up the operation by adding an extra bus. Not always, of course, but usually they can. And scaling down, which is kind of the opposite when it's very quiet, also has benefits, because if you use a smaller vehicle, for example, you're driving around with less air, which is better economically, which make headquarters happy, and it's also better for the environment. So that's something we kind of all want. Because the business case is so straightforward, it has actually become quite household in public transport, sorry. And the contracts that are awarded now to new bus operators kind of include this measure where they have to add this flexibility to their operation and build such models. And that's good news, because I myself work at a company called Lynxx, and we actually built those kind of models for several bus operators here in the Netherlands and abroad. So I wanted to show you a bit of the models that we are using, which are mainly these two, a random forest and an ARIMA, or an ARIMA-X model. We also play around a bit with XGBoost models, which is very nice when the data is imbalanced. But in general, it's these two that we're using. And the input variables that go in there are sometimes quite obvious, like historical occupancy, of course. But we also make use of real-time crowd trends, which means something like if it's busy at 7 a.m., it's also going to be busy at 8 and 9 a.m. in the morning. Weather, of course, also has a big influence. And the special attention is usually drawn to rain, because apparently, if it rains in the morning, there's a decision-making process in people's minds where they either decide to take the bus or the bike, and if it rains, you get wet on the bike, so you take the bus. And the fun thing about that variable is that it actually comes back to you twice. So it comes back in the morning, but also in the afternoon peak, when people again take the bus to get home. We also use, of course, events, which have huge impact on crowdedness. But as a special extra flavor, I asked my colleagues who are working here in the Eindhoven area if they got something fun to add in their models as well. And it turns out that they're actually making use of connecting trains and connecting flights, which I think here is bus 400 and 401 who go to the airport, also have connecting flights as an input measure in the model that we're using. In general, these models tend to capture the fluctuations over the day quite well. But the problem, as always, with crowd prediction is that you're actually interested in the outliers. So we can do really nice on average, but we want to capture those extreme situations. And with traditional models, it's kind of hard. So we went looking, besides tweaking our models, of course, we went looking for an extra data source that gave us some sort of sneak peek into the future. And we found one in travel requests. And I think the more formal title is pre-trip information requests, which you make in, for example, Google Maps. So if you want to go from A to B, you type it in on Google Maps, and it gives you the directions on how to get there. Well, the same exists for public transport, of course, and we are working with a party called 9292, which is kind of Google Maps for public transport. And it's the biggest supplier of public transport information in the Netherlands, processing over 1 billion requests each year. So I guess on an average weekday, it's about 4 million of those requests that all add up and give us some information about the intended behavior of people. So for myself, I brought my own travel advice from this morning. I wanted to be here at 9, and I left from Amsterdam Central Station, and the application tells me to take the train and the bus. Now, of course, by providing that information to 9292 and clicking on an advice, I actually am telling them that I might take that train and that bus. And from the other side of things, we know that that train and that bus might be more occupied. And that variable worked quite well, actually, adding it to our original models, improving our accuracy, and also improving the number of outliers that we could actually capture. For example, if there's a big disruption or a power outlet or something, we actually pick up on the alternative ways that people are taking before we can actually know them ourselves by just doing the math. And we liked it so much, in fact, that we started a partnership between my company Lynxx, which are the model builders, and 9292 as a data supplier. So part of that partnership included that we shifted our scope from the in-vehicle prediction, so predicting how busy a train is going to be, to more like the hotspot-based approach or public domain approach. So together with HERE Technologies, which is a huge player on the navigational market, also based here in Eindhoven, I learned today. We built a solution for a group of public clients united in the smart mobility platform that were struggling with crowd management. And the original pain with crowd management is that it takes you a lot of resources to monitor a few hotspots in the city, and then when it gets too crowded or maximum capacity is reached, you actually close down a shopping street or a park, as we all seen in COVID times, I think. And that's very painful because some people, they make their journey of 30 minutes to get to a park, and then they get told that they have to go home. You see this big electronic sign saying, please, it's full, go away. And what we actually wanted to do was push that moment forward a bit. So as soon as people were actually getting directions to move to a hotspot that might be overcrowded, we wanted to tell them that it actually might be crowded and it might be worthwhile to not show up or show up a bit later. And that's exactly what we did in a few places in and around Amsterdam. The most noteworthy one, I guess, is Zandvoort, which is a beach town near Amsterdam, most famous, I guess, for Formula 1 nowadays. But what we did is we actively monitored the crowding in Zandvoort all summer. And if we were to hit a day that it was crowded, like a threshold was exceeded, then we would send out this big orange message to all users in the 9292 application. And you see one here on the screen. It says, it's going to be very busy in Zandvoort. Please take a look at our crowding predictions. And it turns out that actually when we showed this, people did. Out of the 20,000 people that saw this banner the last day that we tested it, which was in September, unfortunately also the last day of summer that we had, I guess, there were 80,000 people showing up in Zandvoort in total, and 20,000 of those actually saw the message that we put out in our application, either 9292 for public transport or the Here application for cars. And the fun thing is that as they seen the banner, we actually asked them to click on it to see more crowding predictions. And it turned out that 22% of those users actually did. It was good for them because they got extra information about the crowdedness, but it was even better for us because we were able to stalk them with these kind of survey questions that everybody hates, but actually is a very valuable asset for ourselves because we don't know if people like the information, and we don't know if people are prone to change their behavior based on what we're showing them. So the results of that survey were actually quite positive for us. I mean, 80% of people thought that information was useful, whatever useful may mean. But 29%, and this is the percentage that we're actually interested in, said that they might change their behavior based on the information they just seen. So they might consider travel later, or maybe even much earlier. And 29% is a lot. I mean, of course, it might be biased a bit because people who fill in the survey, they might actually be more prone to change their behavior than normal people. But still, if this percentage was only 10%, for example, it would still be enough to shave off that peak in peak crowdedness and solve most of our problems. And that is why I think the general message that we have for this pilot is that we want to make crowding information as publicly available as possible, get it to everybody who wants it, and that is why the crowding API is also public information now, so it's free. If any of you is actually interested, you can reach out and we get you access to the API and you get the crowding predictions, because we believe that by showing that information, people are making conscious decisions about what they're going to do. Like if you see that it's going to be crowded and you still go to the beach, that's fine, but at least you know about it now, and you make the conscious action to go there. You are faced with the consequences of your action. But even better would be if people actually change their plans, and we could prevent the whole situation of overcrowding in total.
Matthijs, the time.
Cool. I have to hurry up. There's one negative aspect of this whole project that we're doing, because we actually wanted to divert people over time, and that worked quite well. But our original idea was to divert people over location. And that basically meant for Zandvoort that we have a beach town there, just above Zandvoort, that is only 8 kilometers away. So we thought it was a good idea to actually divert them over there. But that beach town looks like this, which it's a great place for kite surfing and surfing in general, but it's not the most ideal place to spend your beach day. And we were kind of faced with the problem here, because for us it's really hard to quantify like what scenery means or what safety means. And those are, of course, very important decision factors for mobility and for where you want to spend your leisure activity. And that's, for us, it's way out of reach. But luckily, Soora and her team are on this and way ahead of us, and she will tell you more about it now.
Yes, thank you. I'll start my part with an angle that might sound not fully relevant to what Matthijs said, but you will see how brilliant it will be connected to that at the end of my talk. So, understanding the complex living environment is very important for a wide range of disciplines, from the standpoint of transportation and urban transportation planners, urban planners, and travel behavior analysts. It is important to see, for instance, what's the relations between the living environment and the tendency of people to use active modes, which is related then to health, well-being, and so on. Traditionally, the measurements of living environment was done at a more like a spatial aggregate level, neighborhood level, or even city levels, by asking people basically how they perceive their neighborhood in terms of easiness to reach different facilities, how they perceived in terms of security, safety of the neighborhood, and even to the extent of their feeling of attachment to their neighborhood. And later on, with the emergence of GIS, it was possible also to measure those in a more objective ways when possible. But then soon, this spatial level was criticized by some scholars, saying that even people living within the same neighborhood might experience different streets while they're walking or doing other kinds of active modes. So it's important to basically increase the resolutions of the spatial unit we are looking at. And that was the start of all the effort trying to measure the characteristics of the streets. But then all sorts of challenges came on the way, because I'm talking about 30, 40 years ago, where still none of these technology, Google Earth, Google Map, really exist. So the way it was done, that auditors were sent to the streets, stopping pedestrians, asking them all sorts of questions about their perceptions of the streets they're walking, and so on. Or alternatively, the auditors himself had to walk across lots of streets and then evaluate them across different dimensions, which might not be consistent with the ordinary citizens' perceptions of that part. And then later on, when Google Earth, Google Map, and then the images of Street View images came, it was easier, because then citizens could be seated in the room in front of a computer, and then similar questions could be asked them, but just showing them images. And then there are lots of works that compare these on-site evaluation and picture evaluations, and all the conclusions pointed to the validity of evaluate the streets based on the pictures. But then still, to provide recommendation to urban planners and designers how to redesign the streets to make them comfortable for citizens to use active modes, still an expert needed to evaluate each single pictures in terms of elements exist. For instance, what's the width of sidewalk, if there is a vegetations, plantations, trees, if there are traffic lights, so on and so forth. So still some manual work needed to be done. AI, artificial intelligence, was a revolution in that sense, because then the pictures then could be basically semantically segmented into pixels of different components, different elements. So then everything became kind of automated, and that is what we are doing right now in the research. I presented or put a conceptual framework here. So we want to basically extract the elements of living environment at street level, but also neighborhood level, and then to see basically how people's willingness to walk and the actual walking behavior is linked to this characteristic. We want to also look into the differences exist among different segments of people in terms of their demographic profiles, economic situation, even their personality. To see if there are differences among them in respect to the importance weight they placed on each of those criteria for them to eventually decide to walk. So then our research is in Nanjing, a city in China. What we did is that we collected about 2,000 pictures of the streets. I'll show you exactly how we did that. And then using a deep learning algorithm, Deep Lab version 3, we semantically segmented each of those single pictures in terms of the percentage of pixels for each of the elements listed here. Then we completed this part with web-based questionnaires during which we asked respondents to report their social, demographic, economic. We use well-known personality inventories to also measure their personality in terms of risk-taking, so on and so forth. And then at the end of the questionnaires, you will see in the following slide, they had to evaluate pairs of the pictures. But here it shows how we basically collected that 2,000 pictures of the street. We simplified the road network, and then every 100 meters, we took a snapshot of pictures from 2 directions from Google. The images provided by Google, and then we randomly, basically during the web-based questionnaire, we randomly selected two of those pictures. We paired them, put them together, and then asked the respondent basically to tell us what they think about each of those pictures of the streets in terms of which one they think is more appropriate to take a stroll for leisuring purpose, for commuting purpose, as well as their perceptions of the safety and security of those images. What we plan to do then to understand the elements of the street. Each respondent receive about 50 pairs of pictures, so then we can have enough variability in terms of those elements and the responses of people. And then we plan basically to estimate different models to connect the elements of the streets to the perceptions of the street. And then we also ask them how much they walked the last week. Day by day in terms of the durations, but also the frequency. And we also take into account the busyness of the agenda, because, I mean, they may not have walked last few days simply because they were busy. So we basically want to include every single reasons or determinants that can lead to their decision to walk. We also check the weather at that particular day that they report walking. And yeah, so that's our current work, but then the way that it's connected to the problem Matthijs talked about, it wouldn't take that much mental effort to understand how we can adapt the conceptual framework to find out basically people's willingness to make a choice about their destination, to conduct certain activities, if it's leisure, going to beach and so on. So instead of focus on the walking per se, we collect informations about different environments they want to be in conducting different types of social-related, leisure-related activities. And then, again, we can look into the differences and the importance people place on different aspects to choose the locations. And this information and knowledge can help us then to propose an alternative locations for them when there's a crowdedness somewhere that they originally planned to go. So hopefully we will have opportunity in the future to work together, and then we can basically apply this framework recommendation system to citizens in a city in the Netherlands. That's all, and yeah, I will be happy to receive any question.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. The moderator, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, there are some questions. First of all, thanks a lot both for your presentation. A first question I see is, what do you think is the role of a municipality to avoid the overcrowding on the longer term? Because I think the project you presented was launched by a municipality, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. It was launched by Amsterdam, among a few others. I think the province of North Holland and Flevoland were also involved. But the responsibilities on the long term, of course, are dubious because at the moment, overcrowding kind of is a public health issue, not so much as a public safety issue. And now with the COVID, there's more focus on it. But even before 2019, we still had overcrowded situations where safety of people was in danger, as to say. So they do have the authority to actually intervene with the process. And when they do, it's always going to be painful for the people involved, either the people that have to do it, but also the people that show up. And I think if they take a more rigid role there and maybe influence people beforehand and before the situation escalates, that will always be beneficial. So the focus is now, it's a hot item right now, but I think for the future it will continue to be.
Okay, thank you. And a question coming up in the chat and also raising some discussion is, you talked about sharing the crowd information to the general public. How does that influence the trueness of the prediction? Will it decrease? And do you compensate for this? And linked to that, will that also influence the future input data?
Yeah, the sad answer is yes, it will influence the future input
How
data.
then?
But ideally, we are never right, of course. Ideally, when we predict huge overcrowding, it actually diminishes itself by just sharing the information. I think that's called the prevention paradox that our Minister of Health is talking about all the time now with COVID. But yes, it will have a big impact. So that's why we're looking at alternative or modeled realities, such as digital twins. I heard it in the PhDs as well. I don't know who it was anymore. But so if we model the crowdedness actually in an untouched situation, and we compare it with the situation where we actually did intervene, then it gives us some information about the extent of our effectiveness, but also maybe on how we should tweak our input parameters from the past to still have an adequate model in the future.
Okay, thank you. And how can such crowd prediction also strengthen humanitarian aid during asymmetric events, such as natural violences due to climate change, etc.?
Oof, that one's for me, I guess. Well, it's going to be hard because the big weakness, I think, in the approach is that we are looking at hotspots that are already known to be danger zones or already known to be hotspots where the crowd likes to come. So in the case of calamities or huge problems, it depends. If we're monitoring them, we could actually guide the crowds and use our information. But in general, I'm afraid that it's not a use case that we've looked at thoroughly at the moment.
No, but there's still work for future.
Of course, yeah. It's always good to have work, right?
Good. And the last question I've seen is, we've had in the morning several discussions on AI for health, for instance, and there I think the sense of urgency was rather high, and you haven't expressed it. But can you say why it's really necessary to work on this right now, Soora?
Yeah, maybe I can take this one. Yes, I think the difference of what we talk about and, for instance, what we heard about the cancer, predictions of cancer in patients is that we're talking more about long-term impact of the behavior of citizens, talking about, for instance, using active modes versus motorized vehicles. So we have to basically compare these types of research from that point of view of so the long-term, mid-term and long-term impact that it can have on the health of citizens as well as their well-being and so on. But yeah, maybe we did not elaborate or explicitly pointed out that.
No, but it's good that you can tell it now. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks both, Soora and Matthijs. Thanks.